Good morning, Life City. So good to be with you again this morning. I hope you've had a fantastic time in worship. I'm here this morning, not in my normal, I suppose, slot of preaching to you, but this morning we're going to conduct an interview in the light of the last 10 days with so much that's been happening and surrounding George Floyd and his horrendous death. I thought it would be good that we took a moment ready to begin a dialogue, to have a debate, are really surrounding some of the issues that have really come out in the news that I've certainly been listening to and hearing from. And to that end, I've invited my very good friend, Marcia Bluck, to be with us. Good to see you, Marcia.
Good to be here.
And, you're a wife, you're a mum, you pastor a church over in Dartford.
Yep.
I've done that for the last 5 years. You're a magistrate. You've done that for quite a number of years. You've advised on diversity issues and race matters to the NHS, to local authorities. You've briefed prime ministers, as far as I understand. And I know there's so much that you've had experience with, but I suppose this morning we're just here as two people who know each other. I've known each other for a long time. You used to be part of our church many years ago. And I just want to start off and ask you, in the light of everything that's been happening, how are you feeling? What is your experience at the moment?
Well, first I just want to start, Steve, by saying thank you for inviting me, because it's really important that we start a conversation. It's very easy for us to have opinions and dialogues that are separate and kept within ourselves or even within our community. So I do want to say, as a friend and an ally, thank you for inviting me, because I know where your heart is. I know you want to learn. I know you want to progress more, and my experience with you has been someone who's always championed me and been for me. So I'm delighted to be here. I'm sorry it's under these circumstances.
Yeah, indeed, yeah.
But I guess in answer to your question, there's a phrase that goes around called tragedy fatigue.
Yeah.
And George Floyd's incident was, as you said, horrendous. It was awful. And we were all in shock and taken back by it. But I, as a member of the black community, was quite surprised on even how I responded to that, because I thought I've seen, and heard about Breonna Taylor, Stephen Lawrence, Eric Gardner, Ahmaud Arbery, Sean Riggs. We could literally go on across the US and the UK.
Wow.
And yet there was something about that incident that really flagged up for me 3 simple words, and that was overwhelmed, anger, and tired.
Wow.
Overwhelmed that I thought in 2020, yes, of course I knew racism was there, and many of your viewers know that we have to live with ramifications of racism almost on a daily basis. But something about that visual picture that just took me right back to the lynchings, right back to slavery, right back to some of the things that I would have liked to have thought we'd moved past. I was overwhelmed that this young man, someone similar age to me, had resisted arrest, had shouted out those infamous words that we're now quoting, I can't breathe, was shouting for his mama, saying, I will get in the car, but I can't move, I can't breathe. And yet this person who I refused to name, because I'm not giving them that time, decided that they could put their knee on the neck of an individual like an animal for nearly 9 minutes. Many of us who have black boys, we've done the conversation. It's called the black boy conversation, and many of your viewers might be hopefully nodding.
Really? Is that what you call it?
Well, that's what I call it, and that's what we resonate with. In that, as soon as they get to school age, the very slow drip, drip, drip conversation about how they need to conduct themselves, how if they're approached by the police, and all those different things. And I'm saddened to say that a son who's not long started secondary school, I was faced with a very similar situation. Those of you who know my son know he's polite, he's bright, he's won head teacher awards, all the kind of tick boxes that say he's a model student, he speaks well, he goes to a grammar school. And there he was, I was picking him up, came off the train, went into the shops with 3 of his white friends. 2 of them were making quite a lot of noise. And my son decided, just keep it down, you need to be quiet. We don't need to be making this problem, just let's get our sweets.
Really?
They carried on. And then they left the store, and it left my son with his other white friend. The store clerk looked over, and my son already knew, what's this glare, what's that look about? And then he brought him over and he said, have you been stealing? What have you been doing? And my son said straight away, it wasn't me. It was the other boys making lots of noise. He said, yes, I'm fully aware of that, but I just wanted to ask you.
Wow.
And so my son, because he's the son of an advocate, then started to say, but why did you single me out? Well, I just wanted to ask. And it was only what I call the validation, which I'm ashamed of his white friend who said, no, actually, he wasn't doing anything. We were just in here buying sweets, that then almost convinced the shop owner or shop officer to be able to release him and say he could go. Suffice to say, the whole full law of the monster came down, and we dealt with that. But it was in that moment that I thought I knew I had to have the conversation. I know it goes on. I've got 4 brothers. One changed his car because he got fed up of being stopped in a Mercedes, even though he was in a suit, coming home from work. But somehow that depiction, I think, of George Floyd just brought it all back. You know, it was almost like trauma. And I think some people have said this, that in the light of the pandemic, maybe when life's just a little bit slower, maybe when there's a little less distractions, and we compartmentalise some of these racist incidents that we have to suffer or experience, somehow maybe we had a little bit more time to process and reflect, I don't know. But somehow just seeing that image seemed to just bring everything up. I mean, for me, you know, I started getting, you know, things sent to me, videos sent to me, and my first reaction is I just don't want to watch this. You know, I would like to feel, and it's an interesting thing about how we feel, isn't it? I'd like to feel that in some way I'm aware of some of the issues that my black friends face. I don't pretend that I understand them all. I don't always understand it. I mean, the nuances of things that you've just been talking about. And the last thing that I wanted to do was see, a white man with his knee on the neck of a black man. You couldn't get as strong, as you've already said, colonial slavery image. And I suppose for me, 8 minutes of it, 8 minutes of 8 minutes and 46 seconds.
46 seconds of that happening, you know, with people watching and nothing happening. And just the inhumanity of somebody crying out and not receiving any human response whatsoever, you know, is just heartbreaking.
Absolutely.
And for me, you know, sometimes people think I'm a little, you know, not very emotional or whatever, but I don't want to see that stuff. I really don't, because it reinforces to me some of the horrors that we are facing still today. And we hear this phrase a lot, systemic racism. Mm-hmm. You know, it's been in the news and it's been on all the social media. You know, when you hear those words, what does that mean for you?
Well, I think if I can just quickly go back to that image, I think there was anger as well, because there in a moment it felt as if the whole representation of white privilege had come to the forefront, that this individual thought, despite being filmed, he could still do what he was doing, and there would be no recourse.
No repercussions,
You know, and I was so tired even during that moment where I just thought, you know, we know racism happens. It's not a shock for us. We don't get the privilege of turning off the TV and then saying we don't want to watch it. And I think it's important that people feel uncomfortable, people feel discomfort about it, because as you said, it's about inhumane. You know, I watch on social media all the time, if an animal was abused, nobody needs to tell them what's wrong with it and why that needs to be shared. And yet suddenly this whole issue around racism, Black Lives Matter. And I just became so tired of thinking, why do I need to keep educating everyone? We know that our systems are broken. We know that there's a disproportionate higher rate in our education system. If you're a young black boy, you're more likely to be excluded. You're likely to have predicted grades that are lower than your white counterparts. You know, I was tired of thinking my heritage doesn't count anymore. If I want to braid my hair, wear it in a locks, that somehow that's substandard to whatever norm is out there.
Or it conjures up some kind of image.
Exactly. I'm tired of history being whitewashed, that as if the black people are the savages and the white people came and rescued and saved us.
Yeah.
You know, so when I think of something like systemic racism, it's a really big word that it conjures up for me. But before we go into that, I'd like to just introduce to some people who might not have heard it, the concept of unconscious bias.
Yeah.
Because for me, that's where it starts,
Right.
where in our mindsets, because this is about hearts and minds as well, in our mindset where we have assumptions, past experiences, something's happened to us, stereotypes, and it all creates a bias in our brain that makes us judge a situation or an individual a certain way. Now, when we act on that bias, it then becomes racist.
Right.
So if I see a young black male in a hoodie and in my head I'm thinking, oh, I feel a bit uncomfortable. I read about gang crime. I read about this. Maybe that's what it is. That's bad enough, especially when I don't recognise I have that bias. But when I then cross the road or I ring the police, then that becomes into racism. And so I just think it's important to understand that, because a lot of people will say, I'm not racist, I'm not racist. But actually what might be going on is a lot of unconscious bias, which is then informing how we behave. And that's where I think we end up with systemic racism, because it means the policies, the processes, our institutions are all formed around this bias that we have, that there's a white privilege, there's a white normal.
So let's just talk about that for a moment, because this is a phrase that's come out, you know, a lot recently again. And I think for me, you know, it's a phrase that I've not even really considered much. And why would I? I'm white, you know, it's not something that's there before me. But maybe just try and, from your perspective, you know, just try and explain to us, what is white privilege?
Okay, just to keep it short, I'm not in one of my training sessions.
Yeah, go on.
For me, the problem with the word privilege makes, for example, white people who are not as affluent think, but I don't have any privilege, I'm struggling. So for me, I prefer the term white opportunity.
Right.
So that then what it now says is there's a social construct about me being white that determines the normal in society. So whether that's in the provision of goods, whether that's in institutions, but that becomes the normal. Now, very, very, very simplistically, but hopefully not to patronise, but so that people can understand it at a basic level before we go up. If you go in your first aid box and you pick out a box of plasters and you're told they're flesh coloured.
Yeah, right, yeah. Yeah, I get it, yeah.
Who made that assumption that that is the normality?
Yeah. Yeah.
Who made the normality that certain features, therefore, are the norm?
Yeah.
You know, I've had friends where they've gone to apply for jobs and they've considered changing their surname because they think there'll be more opportunity.
I know people who've done that in our own church, who've changed their name because, you know, exactly for that reason. It sounds more acceptable and white, or more part of our society, yeah.
And it's about recognising that when we anglicise, because we're here in the UK, when we anglicise things, that somehow that affords us more privilege or more opportunity. And it's ensuring that we know that as black people, but white people understand when they just wake up in the morning and do something very normal, that actually that's because they have the opportunity to be able to do that. Now, in institutions, what we want to see is a change of hearts and minds. I'm a legal girl, so I'm obviously going to say we want the minimum standard in systemic racism to happen, and that the only way you can do that is by legislation. We saw that in the amendment to the Race Relations Act with Stephen Lawrence, then we saw it take on further with the Equality Act in 2010. But it can't be just about the law, because if it was, we wouldn't be in this incident now. We've got to be able to transform and ensure that the institutions, the levels that we climb, all of that can eradicate or begin to eradicate racism. We'll never eradicate it 100%, because as long as people are alive doing their own thing, that will happen. But we want to reduce it in a way that there's more people saying, this isn't acceptable. Why are you recruiting that person and they're not the best person for the job? Why are you trying to get someone who looks like you? Because that makes your life easier. So I think with systemic racism, it's important to increase representation.
I heard a couple of things. I mean, I don't know whether you heard them, but I heard that face recognition on iPhones is based on white Caucasian. And actually, I found struggle to recognise black features. I'd never even considered that it would even enter into something like that. I mean, it's kind of amusing.
And that is like a systemic racism, because what it's saying is it hasn't considered, because actually probably the people around me are not different, so nobody's challenging or even just bringing a diverse viewpoint. So I've now decided, well, this must be the normal.
Yes.
And it hasn't, and that becomes dangerous, because even with the best intention in the world, I'm sure someone didn't sit there going, I'm going to make it only work for this one race.
Yes.
But that's, in a sense, even more how damaging it is, that it happens so unconsciously in our lives.
I want to talk just on this issue and just to get your thoughts. A report came out recently, the last few days, on the BBC about NHS and about black nurses. I found it difficult to get my head around. I thought, really, is this? But as far as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, and maybe you're a bit more gender up than I am, but there was a report saying that basically black nurses were being sent into coronavirus wards ahead of white nurses, which just seems strange to me. You know, nurses are nurses; they all do their job. I mean, if that's correct, that's terrible. I mean, what are your thoughts on something like that?
I personally wouldn't be surprised if that's the truth, and actually that was going to lead me on to talking about the NHS, funnily enough, in systemic racism, because I've personally worked in that area where there was a phrase coined, which was the snow-capped mountain, which said, yes, you can tick your box that we're nice and diverse at the lower levels or even mid-levels, but actually the higher you go, the whiter you become. And so I went in and did a piece of work in London around trying to increase some of that representation and working through mentoring schemes and different things. So I'm not surprised the NHS has been flagged up with that again. And I think because there's a disproportionate amount of nurses from BAME, Black, Asian, minority ethnic groups, I think at the very least, it was going to happen because they're disproportionately represented at that level. And I can't comment on it because I haven't fully read it, but I would say I wouldn't be surprised if there was some unconscious bias in how they were dealing with that. And I think we just need to be careful, because going on to coronavirus and COVID-19, I'm sure you're aware that it's highlighted that black people are much more likely to die from it. And there's a couple of reasons. People have tried to mention genetics and said because we're more likely to have diabetes and hypertension, but that's not actually the full story to the construct, because it says once you catch coronavirus, if you have those two elements, then you are more likely for it to be fatal. But there is a social and biology construct to that, because it also means that black and minority ethnic people are overrepresented in a lot of essential work in both the NHS, the transport sector and shop work. So it's really sad to hear that those that are protecting us the most are now receiving the least amount of protection.
So just pivoting a little bit, this phrase that's been out, Black Lives Matter, and people have responded to that. I've seen it on social media where they go, yeah, of course, but all lives matter. What is it that people are not getting when they say that?
Well, call it very simplistic, but I have a theory that when people say, but all lives matter, sometimes I think the person who's saying that is probably benefiting from white privilege, actually, because they can't mentally just get their head around that there might be some other group out there at a disadvantage than who they are, because the whole of their life, everything they experience in education, in work, and all those different arenas has never really caused an obstacle. So I think it makes people feel easier if we can say all lives matter. Oh, it's nice and inclusive. Well, I'm here. I can only speak for myself. I'm not a rep of the black community, but I can say, well, all lives do matter as a fundamental. That goes without saying. But when a particular section of that group are suffering at a disadvantage, when things are happening to them quite differently than another group, then surely you need to pull that out. That's like saying, well, we shouldn't have any campaigns for prostate cancer, or we shouldn't have any campaigns for breast cancer, because, you know, what's the point of highlighting it because all cancer's serious?
Yes.
Of course not, but I think most people do that because it makes them feel uncomfortable. I mean, even in the word black can be very short, sharp, and very positive, and I think sometimes people are just scared of it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, as a church leader and a leader of a church, as you know, that is predominantly black, it's interesting just looking sometimes at some of the things that we might find or even going on in our own church community. And I think I've heard some stuff this week of people who've talked to me and rung in, and I found some of that listening difficult at times, you know, because I never want to feel like there's some kind of us and them, that, you know, that there's something that's separating us. And language is such an important thing, and we kind of use it in all sorts of ways. But one of the things that's come out is this term microaggressions. Maybe you could try and talk to us for a moment about what are these microaggressions? How can a microaggression come out without people even realizing it, for instance?
Okay, well, a microaggression is one of those things that it's almost like a slight or an insult. It's very much around language, and it can be quite ambiguous, almost to the point that you're not quite sure, did someone make an insult to me or not? But there's something about what they said and how they said it, you know, that there's a bit of a slur towards a group. So it could have been something, what I said earlier, such as, oh, you speak quite well.
Right.
I've heard somebody once listen to a black gentleman give a really great speech, and their response at the end was, oh, he speaks like a white black man, as if black people can't speak well.
Right.
You know, I've had it where people will go, oh, look at your hair. It's quite interesting and fluffy. My children have that quite a lot.
Really?
Where it's like, can I just feel your hair because it feels like wool? And it's almost as if, why are you saying something's rather weird or slightly off with that? So that's where we do have to be careful with language, that if there's a connotation in there that's actually saying, again, if we think of white privilege, where I'm identifying something that's different from my norm, and therefore I'm going to make out as if it's quite unusual. I have that with my background, I have it with where I live, that people will be, oh, so you live in that type of property, in that type of the neighbourhood.
Wow.
Oh, like they're surprised.
Like you shouldn't have it or something.
Yeah, and I'm thinking, where did you want me to live? To make you feel comfortable. So I think language is really important, but I will say I've always personally been a proponent of using the correct terminology and the correct language, but not forsaking dialogue, because there's also been a mist around this where people are almost scared of saying the wrong thing, that they often don't say anything at all. And we're not here to overly educate everyone, but I think we need to accept that if someone genuinely isn't sure if they said something that was incorrect, that we need to be okay with correcting them and actually leading people on to more knowledge. Because if we don't tell them, then there's an element that we have to be careful that we can't then accuse them of being ignorant. So people need to read up, make Google their friend. I know you've put a book list, a recommended reading on there as well. And I just think this is only part of the story, part of the conversation, but people really need to educate themselves.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I just began to sort of, I don't know, broaden my world, I suppose. And I never thought maybe I was as naive in some respects as I'm finding out that I am in some things. And as a church leader, I'm thinking, well, okay, what can we do? What steps can we take moving forward? Because I suspect there's a lot of people out there today who may be listening, thinking, okay, it's all great, Steve, that you explain this and Marcia's explained this, but how are we going to move forward? You know, what can we do? You know, what can we do in our churches? What can we do as church leaders to move forward here?
One thing that we introduced about a year ago was something called circles. And it was about people expounding their circles of influence or their circles of relationships. Because we saw that it was important that people, when I looked on social media, had black friends. They had black work colleagues. But when you saw the selfies of spa days, when you saw the selfies of nights out and just different family construct, it suddenly dawned on me that it was incredibly mono.
Right.
So one of the things we wanted to say to people was, get out of your comfort zone.
Come on, get into a stretch zone a little bit, yeah.
Exactly. So rather than go to the people that you know, rather than go to the people who think like you and are like you and make
Right.
your life comfortable and easy,
Uh-huh.
get out and start mingling. You might, as a benefit, learn from someone
Mm-hmm.
that doesn't look like you, but also you'll get a better sense of empathy
Right.
because you're walking with these people on their day to day. So that's something I would definitely have said to leaders. Learn to get into people's worlds.
Yeah.
Don't just have them as somebody that you see at a church service or in an organisational setting, but where you can actually meet with people informally, because
Yeah.
it's there that we really understand where people are
That's
coming
what
from.
community is about, isn't it? It's about learning about one another, yeah. And sometimes you need to push yourself into new relationships.
Absolutely, and I think it's there that then we increase diversity. Then it isn't something that we have to sit there and decide, right, let me do my checklist.
Yeah.
Have I got this person at this level?
Right.
It will become organic.
Yeah.
Because you'll think, actually, I really value these different opinions. They help me be better. They
Right.
stretch me. They help me with my blind spot.
Yeah.
They give a different perspective. Because how many of us know if it's us doing the same things all the time,
Right.
we'll get the same results.
Yeah,
And we
absolutely.
don't want that. So I think that's really important for leaders, but to be really open. And I'd say whether it's a black person or someone else that feels disadvantaged, to be open to that, that when people want to have the dialogue, when they want to get to know you, it's really easy to be a bit cynical. But actually, how are we going to move forward if we don't have a little faith?
Right.
And you know, I just think that that is where God wants us to be. This whole coronavirus has shook the church up. And I think in some respects for a good reason. So rather than just look at George Floyd's incident as merely a negative narrative, let his life count.
Right.
Let it count for something that says, as a church, we're going to stand and speak for the voiceless.
Right.
As a church, we're going to do transformation, because this is at the heart of the gospel. Jesus is bothered about hearts and minds. And if as a church, we cannot be that role model to the world
Right.
that is broken in despair, then what hope is there
Absolutely.
for us? And I'd like to say to anybody listening who, like me, has travelled through this whole journey and had every emotion possible, it's okay to be overwhelmed. Join the club.
Yeah.
It's okay to be angry. Join the club. It's okay to feel tired of saying the same things, but we've got to be down there and dust ourselves off and get back up again.
Right.
We've got to do this journey because these are exciting times. I do think in history, this is one of those moments the church can really be counted. It can
Wow.
be a light on a hill.
That's right.
And my heart for my church and for your church, Life City, is that they use this as an opportunity to be a light to their broken community, a light and example to the broken world. Because the enemy wants us divided.
Absolutely,
I can
yeah.
tell you that now.
Yeah.
He will not be happy
No.
when we're united.
That's right.
So let's keep the devil unhappy.
Yeah.
Let's stay united. Let's stay strong with one purpose, and that is to see the kingdom of God advance.
Wow. Marcia, it has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for coming, taking time to share this morning. I'm sure this is just the beginning of
Yeah.
a wider debate, a bigger conversation. I know there's probably churches up and down the country who are doing very similar things to what
Yeah.
we're doing here and now. But I hope and I pray that, you know, we'll be able to move forward, that our churches are going to advance, that we're going to become stronger, that we're going to be able to implement things that are going to improve, yeah,
Absolutely.
where we are, what we do, how we interact, how we relate, what we understand. And because at the end of the day, it's for his kingdom. So thanks very much for being here. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.